Nous voici de nouveau.
Well, we are back to the plenary to move forward with the Q&A session. And I think that you have the opportunity to react, to make further comments, to raise questions and ask questions to the different keynote speakers. Please wait for the mic before raising your questions so that it will make the job of interpreters easier. We already have a first question. That's wonderful.
I have a question for Norton. Thank you for your interesting presentation. You've talked about the culture of constitutionality, and I wondered how acquainted the general public is with it. You've mentioned that when there's a failure of a few representatives, the public sees this as a failure of the whole system. But when a party flouts these moral conventions, these political conventions, can the public see that the failure of the system happened due to these individuals, or does it, are they able to understand what caused it, or do they just see the failure of the system?
Merci beaucoup. Je vous propose que l'on prenne une petite salve de questions avant de commencer directement les réponses. Donc,
Maybe we can collect more questions before we answer. There is a question over there at the back of the room. So, Lena, we have the opportunity to make a few more steps today, thanks to the fact that the gentleman is at the back of the room. Well, thank you very much. Regarding the long-term challenges or elements at stake, I will be slightly provocative. But do you believe it is really useful to think of all those long-term institutions? Don't you think that we already have all what we need available today in terms of information, in terms of climate challenges, digital challenges? I don't think that the question here is about assessment on the long term, on the long run, but the possibility to force politicians to take them on board. It's quite different. Indeed, we target different tools here. How can we force politicians to take that into consideration? Otherwise, well, it will be the end, you know, because we will make huge mistakes. In France, we have an administration, we do criticize quite a lot, but they have good reports, plenty of reports, very detailed reports, but we need to know how we can invite politicians to take that on board, because we have plenty of documentation available. Thank you very much. Another question, a third one maybe. Don't be afraid. Another question here in the middle.
Thank you. Sorry, in English, apologies. I've got two questions. One for Philip Norton, first of all. With very interesting papers, all three, thank you. Philip, on the question of confidence and the relationship with trust, one of the features of parliamentary practice, as you of course will know in the UK, is growing rebelliousness of MPs within Parliament. I wonder, do you think that growing rebelliousness has an impact on popular trust? Because of course you made the point, which I think was an interesting one, about the way individuals behave being used to judge the collective institution. And bearing in mind, I think, as I recall from some political science studies I've read, rebelliousness of MPs is seen as quite popular among MPs. But then at the same time, if those MPs are seen in an institutional sense as being rebellious and bringing Parliament into disrepute, and you think of all the 2017 to 2019 Brexit disputes that we had, I just wonder what you think that kind of underlying shift to more rebellious politicians, what the impact on popular trust and public perception of Parliament might be. And then a second question for the Belgian colleague, anyone who feels that they want to chip in on it. I think in your paper you mentioned a few times that about the relationship between individual and collective responsibility. And individual, I think you said, melts into collective responsibility a number of times. And that was very interesting to hear, thinking about the relationship between individual and collective responsibility in the British system, where I would say we probably don't see that same connection in many ways. Perhaps, if I was put on the spot, I would say individual responsibility is still probably the prime, certainly when we're talking about scandals and poor performance of government. Individual responsibility is often the primary vehicle through which those sort of debates are had. This minister has performed poorly, this department has performed poorly, it is their fault individually. So I just wonder whether you think that relationship between individual and collective in the Belgian context, is that a function or related to the nature of the Belgian political system, that there is such an emphasis on dealing with things through collective rather than individual responsibility because of the circumstances of the way governments function? So, thanks.
Merci beaucoup. Puisque ici nous avons 4 questions, peut-être une toute dernière.
We have already 4 questions. I love the figure 5, so I would be delighted to have a 5th question. Any volunteer for a 5th question? You don't want to please me. You don't want me to have 5 questions to offer to our keynote speakers. That's so sad, actually. Well, never mind. Let's jump into it with the 5 questions. I don't know, Philip Lord Norton, maybe?
If I may, I'll take them in reverse order. What about confidence and growing rebelliousness? I'll talk about that first question, and growing rebelliousness more or less out of self-interest, because that's what my academic career is built on. Looking at parliamentary rebelliousness, so the person who's benefited most is actually me, because I monitored it and drew attention to it, and then looked at the significance of it. To some extent, you can, from a parliamentary point of view, you can argue it's quite healthy because it keeps the government on its toes, because ministers have to look over their shoulders. So until about 1970, governments had an overall majority. They were guaranteed they're going to win a vote. Since 1970, they've normally been assured they're going to win, but not always guaranteed. So they've got to be more wary. They've got to listen to what members are saying. And what you see in terms of members voting against their own side, which has increased since the 70s, the effect of it will vary depending on the overall majority. What you've got to bear in mind is the public dimension is to some extent the tip of the iceberg, because a lot of what happens is behind the scenes. And that's something else on which I've written quite a lot in terms of the interaction that goes on behind the scenes that scholars tend to ignore because it's not observable and measurable. But it matters because that will quite often determine what goes on. So quite often a united party reflects division, publicly united, because divisions have been resolved through private means. The party caucuses and so on can be quite important. If it's not resolved there, then it becomes public. And I say that can be quite healthy. It keeps the government on its toes. You touched upon the point that electors may favour their members. I mean, a lot depends on the situation, the issue, particularly if it's constituency related. So that benefits. So it's not the system that's, in terms of popular perception, that's threatened. It's more the parties that suffer politically, because it's a dictum of politics that electors do not reward divided parties. And that's been pointed out recently with the fate of the last government. So it's the parties who suffer. Otherwise, I don't think there is a great disbenefit, as long as the rebelliousness itself then does not challenge the capacity of government to actually govern in the sense of delivering a fairly coherent programme of public policy. So it can challenge, rebelliousness can result in sort of challenging government, keeping it on its toes, constrain it, but not preventing it from being government, having a coherent programme of public policy on which it can then stand before the electors at the next elections to be held to account. That is the fundamental point about having a party in government. Stands before the electors as the body answerable, responsible for public policy. But in between elections, members helping keep it on its toes. And that's why that's my point about the intra-party mode of executive-elected relationships is so important in a system with an overall majority. I'll leave it to my colleague to talk about individual responsibility in a British sense. That is important, but ministers individually tend to be protected then by collective responsibility because ministers rally round, they can call on their majority to protect the minister. So ministers are answerable for their departments, but it's very rare they would resign because of some error performed as a minister. I mean, we tend to say, oh, you hear this quite often, you'll be aware of this, people, oh, nowadays ministers don't resign, in the old days resigned. No, they didn't. It's a myth. They only resigned personal scandal, something like that, rather than mishandling of their department. So I think those are the points there. Sorry, the long-term, so can I next take, I say, reverse order. On the point about long-term, I agree completely with your point about challenges. We can identify the challenges. I think the real problem is mobilising politicians to address those challenges, because they will be driven by self-interest. You will not necessarily get unity of how to tackle those when it's in the short-term interest of the parties. So, yes, climate change is a problem. Hang on. But if we tackle it, it's going to be the disbenefit of current electors in doing that. So we're not quite sure about that. So the real issue is not identifying I think, the future challenges. It's actually getting agreement on how to tackle them, for which you need all-party agreement, because you can get, obviously, changes in government. So you need to have that element of continuity in tackling them. So that I think is the real challenge. On the first sort of combined questions, constitutionalism, are people there familiar with the concept? Well, no. And in a way I'd hope they weren't, because it's so imbued, because it's not to do with thinking about constitutionalism as such, it's just that imbued element of accepting the legitimacy of the process, that the people in place are there to give effect to ensuring that the system works. So it's the underpinning, in a way it's a bit like the earlier point made about diffuse support. The legitimacy of the system is important because that's why it works. So that, in effect, the executive is the creature of the constitution, not the other way round. Because that's the problem with authoritarian systems. You've got constitutions that exist in written form, but they're the creature of the regime. So there's constitutions, codified constitutions, but no constitutionalism. We've got a constitution in the UK, but it's uncodified, but you've got constitutionalism. And so it's eminent in the system rather than something that you necessarily need to discuss. It's if you start to question it that you start to worry, because people then are actually starting to challenge it and think about it. Parties flouting conventions. Well, they would get no, they tend not to. And it's not so much parties, but it's more politicians, those in government, because those are the ones largely bound by conventions, the rules of behaviour that are treated as, what was David Feldman put it, right behaviour. So it's the politicians making the system work. So it's in their interest to make it work. If they push against it, it gets noticed. Boris Johnson was the one who came closest to that. And the public opprobrium was such that I think that then sort of forced him to stand back. So there is an acceptance of those. And as I say, if they work against them, which is rare, there's a pushback or there's some adaptation to take account of it. So more recently, say Boris Johnson, particularly over prorogation. Otherwise, if there's a problem, for example, I mean, the only instances that come to mind was the problems on the Conservative side with how they used to choose a leader. 963, it brought the sovereign into having to make a choice. This was so they changed the rules for electing the leader. So we tend to adapt to that. So there's not too much flouting because it's in the self-interest of the politicians not to do that. So we've got issues, but those aren't the issues that are problems with the current system.
Thank you very much. Peut-être pour continuer
Well, maybe to move forward with the answers, Julien and Matthias, I'd like to give you the floor. Well, regarding our way to look at individual political responsibility and the potential tensions with the collective responsibility, I don't know whether it is something typical of Belgium, but it is, of course, something specific to our country. Why is it so? Well, it has simply to do with the history and the background, of the country. It is a responsibility which has always existed, and the individual one was always considered to be something apart from the collective responsibility. Except the history, there is maybe something to say about the object of the responsibility. We do talk about different things when we talk about individual political responsibility and collective political responsibility, because the scope of responsibility might differ, of course, because the collective one might be activated or might be related to the general policies implemented by the government. It is related to their political a project, to the roadmap at the governmental level. While individually, we do refer to the action or inaction of the minister concerned in the framework of his portfolio activities, and therefore this will cover, as we have not mentioned it, the liability for the act or for actions carried out by other people, by the administration, or by members of staff. So people have to be liable for this individually. Still regarding the individual responsibility, I would like to insist upon the fact that it does not only refer to individual scandals, which would impact one minister individually. The individual political responsibility might be activated, for example, if there is a dysfunctioning within a service or an administration under the responsibility of the minister in question, and this problem would affect the only administration of that particular minister or a specific problem related to his or her administration. Well, thank you very much. The best of us amongst us, Céline. Well, regarding the question you did raise, it is true that we have all relevant information at our disposal. We have scientific reports, we have lengthy and detailed reports about climate change. We know we might run into serious problems if we don't take that into account. But we need a kind of political approach in that particular field. We know what we have to do. That's true, but there are many scenarios which might be identified. Several solutions, many solutions are available. And of course, we would use as a starting point here the fact that we would like to have a planet Earth on which we could live decently and in good conditions. Geoengineering might be potentially a solution, or a solution we could put in place for a certain period of time while we are waiting for other solutions. So we can do a little bit of planning. We can also determine the kind of social justice we would like to prevail in the field of social justice. But we also have many foresighting plans, many a kind of foresighting exercise which has to be done. We know the consequences, although there might be some uncertainties because we don't always know which solutions might or which result solutions might bring. And we don't have the narrative going hand in hand with those elements because we know more or less which problems we might face, but we do not have a narrative behind it which would have to do with past utopia. Then I think that we do not have a detailed and thorough analysis about the future vision of the government. And that's what we have to do at the level of the institutions, to force the government to deliver on its vision of the future, to have at least information at our disposal and have an opportunity to discuss it. And more precisely, legislations and public policies do not always go hand in hand with foresighting. So what we need to do is to do a kind of foresighting exercise with the population. And we do not all have a critical mind, about those visions of the future. You need to be, an expert in the field with a view to have a critical opinion about the future. And I'm looking at Guillaume while saying that. Well, that's it. And we talk about mobilization, about the possibility to oblige and force the government to act. And of course, I hope that we will have a future on planet Earth. That's my personal desire. But if we look at this reality in a cold way, we need to determine whether or not we are still on the right track regarding the political power. And that's what I was trying to discuss with you, because we talk about legal responsibility. We talk about the treaties, the duties you have from a jurisdictional point of view. But if you look at that from the lens of trust, that's not obvious to have something constructive at the end of the day. Well, I don't have any empirical analysis, but it might increase the trust of those willing to get strong measures and robust measures. But it might also decrease the trust in national authorities, because their leeway, their margin of maneuver is quite narrow and limited. It might also reduce the margin of maneuver of the government, because maybe the government will not bear with the decisions imposed upon it. So I'm not saying we should not do that. That's not what I'm saying. But if we try to look at the situation in a very cold way, to take a bit of distance, I'm not really sure it is the best way. And the Swiss example is a very good illustration, a very good evidence of all that, because the Swiss government insisted upon the fact that they would not stick to the ruling because it goes against democracy. And in Belgium, we had 8,000 decrees and elements of the kind. Well, that's my assumption. But to turn to a judge with a view to solve this lack of political responsibility, or the weakness of the political responsibility, well, turning to that is sometimes a dead end, and I'm saying it because that's the kind of thing I've tried to use in the past. So instead, we should reinvest the political responsibility in the broad sense of the term, with a view to force the information and the readability and the justification about the future. I did not say it would work. I simply insisted in my presentation about the fact that we would need to envisage those possibilities and have a critical mind about what has been developed today, because it's not necessarily what will arouse the interest and a great mobilization within the public authorities. But we can further discuss it during the drink. No, it's already 45 past 4. Well, I think that we need to conclude, maybe, or a last question, or two last questions, one extra question over there. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for these very interesting comments. And I think that we need to articulate today's panel with the one we had yesterday on this notion of trust. And I would like to talk about the articulation between collective and individual responsibility of the government, bearing in mind a monitoring of exemplarity. And you will tell me whether at a national level it does echo to what you experience. In UK, with the impeachment in France, we had different charters at the level of monarchies, constitutional monarchies. So individually, we tended to point out a person because of his personal behavior. And then we had constitutionalism which meant that we had a collective approach in terms of responsibility, and an infringement was not needed anymore with a view to engage the responsibility of the government. So then emerged this notion of political responsibility, and the individual responsibility is part and parcel of the collective responsibility of the government. And most of the time the collective responsibility of the government is supposed to protect the minister as a member of the majority, except if the majority is willing to get rid of the government, which is usually not the case. And Olivier Beau did refer to a third phase of responsibility, where the collective responsibility does not work anymore, does not work anymore, and then we can get back to a more individual responsibility. And there we would focus on a more criminal approach, so criminalization of responsibility, so we would not be anymore on the political in the political field. And all these elements are discussed not in front of parliamentarians, but in front of the public at large. That's why we have a kind of a snowball effect in terms of resignations, because the pressure from the public opinion is too strong. And in that particular case, we can see that it is not possible anymore to protect the minister. Well, that's something I did see or anticipate at the French level, and I wanted to know whether there would be any echo at the level of your respective countries. Given that it is a huge topic, we need to start with Céline, and we won't take more questions because it's a big one, so we will try to answer that one. Well, I don't think that we have the same criminalization approach in Belgium, but Matthias and Julien probably have more to say on the topic, and my assumption would be the following. I think that it is through the mobilization of the civil responsibility that we would work proceedings in front of a civil judge. That's where we would engage the political responsibility, and not necessarily an individual responsibility, as mentioned by Julien, but we would focus on the civil responsibility. But that's my assumption.
Oui, moi, je suis d'accord avec ce que...
I agree with what Céline has just said on civil liabilities, but for the third part, the idea of collective accountability and individual accountability that would take over, if you like. There is some phenomena that we can see in the Belgian life and constitutional life, probably favored by data in terms of parliament composition and electoral composition. It's very difficult to make a government fall, but we have now very long negotiations to form a new government. So when a new team comes in office, the trend, at least over the past years, to go until the end of the mandate. But throughout the mandate, there is a series of ministers leaving the ship. As Julien said before, maybe not, well, it depends what we mean by scandal, but for political accountability, and there are many practical cases, but we didn't mention examples because we didn't have time. But the Minister of Justice resigned because the prosecutor's office had not tackled an extradition request for someone. He was in Belgium. He had committed a terrorist attack. And so we are here in something that is really the pure political accountability because of his administration, of course, but then it did work. It did not challenge the whole governmental team. Just one minister had to resign. There was the question to see whether other ministers, because of their competences, were involved in well, when it comes to asylum, migration, whether the Minister of the Interior was also involved, but it remained an individual liability and not a collective liability. So there are some cases like this, and this is not the only case we had over the past few years, when there is a political accountability with the criminal option was not really used. And the habit in Belgium is the habit that is to ask ministers indicted to resign right away. The latest case is 2015, if I remember well. But here there was just an indictment and the person has not been judged yet, so it's not the matter of being cleared, but the whole criminal procedure is not finished for this person who's no longer a minister but had to resign in 2015 or 2016. So there are some criminal liabilities that might come into play, but in the older history of Belgium, in the 80s and the 90s, well, there were cases, but now on the most recent history, we don't see this trend, but there was a series of resignations because of an individual liability. But there was not such a thing as the contaminated blood case in France. And we were afraid that with COVID, these issues would come back because there was some pressure, but it didn't turn into criminal liabilities. But the Parliament has still a role to play because in almost all the resignations we've seen over the past few years, the Parliament tools have contributed to increase the pressure on the ministers because a minister is under the spotlight of the media, and so parliaments have tools available, and also some threats of motions that they can use, but sometimes the media have accelerated the fall of some ministers. Thank you. Professor Norton, do you want to say something?
Yes, very quickly. Thank you very much. Sorry. Westminster gets the last word. I start with a very technical point, but it's the sort of audience this might appeal to. In looking at collective and minister and individual responsibility, we tend to refer to them as conventions. I term them doctrines. I won't dwell on that because it gives me an opportunity to say if you want to know more about that distinction, you'd have to get one of my recent books called Governing Britain, available from all good booksellers. In terms of collective and individual responsibility, I've touched on the point before, so I don't need to dwell. Collective responsibility sort of tends to subsume the individuals, it protects them. So ministers are fairly secure, but there is both the political and legal liability. The legal is not in terms of anything to do with criminal law, it's administrative law. They could be challenged on, they can be subject to judicial review if they actually ultra vires. So that's fairly straightforward. There's more of it nowadays. Judicial review is extremely extensive, and ministers and civil servants were given a doctrine called the judge over your shoulder to beware of the courts and what they can do in terms of challenge under judicial review. Individual responsibility politically is significant, but not because of the chamber, the House itself. It's more towards the party. So the party caucus, is the minister jeopardising the party's role? So if a minister goes, it's not because the whole House has taken any action against them. It's because essentially the parliamentary party, the party caucus, if the minister has lost the confidence of their supporters behind them, parliamentary caucus, then they may go. There have been some very high-profile cases of that in the United Kingdom, where they've lost the confidence of the parliamentary party. But otherwise, as long as they maintain the confidence of their colleagues, they are secure.